Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tim Fortier. I'm the Communications Coordinator with New Hampshire Municipal Association. We thank you for joining us for this 2022 webinar series, Default Budgets and How They Work. I'd like to introduce our presenters today. We have Barrett Christine, who's the Executive Director with the New Hampshire School Boards Association. Good afternoon, Barrett.
Good afternoon, Tim. Thank you to the Municipal Association for inviting NHSBA and allowing us to participate in this webinar. I saw the registration list. I'm glad to see that we have about 3 dozen school board members joining us this afternoon. So after today's presentation, if there are either follow-up questions or lingering questions, please reach out to myself, or also on the screen with us is our staff attorney, Will Phillips.
Yes, and I did want to make mention, we have a special guest with us today, and that is Staff Attorney Will Phillips. Good afternoon, Will.
Oh, you're muted. Okay.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for joining us, Will. And on NHMA's side, we have Catherine Heck, who's our Government Finance Advisor. Good afternoon, Catherine.
Good afternoon, Tim.
And Nate Grays, our Government Affairs Counsel. Good afternoon, Nate.
Good afternoon, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone. Let's dive right into it, shall we?
I just wanted to make mention to the audience that if you have a question, we ask that you put it into the Q&A function box. The chat box has been disabled. So again, any questions to the Q&A function. And we will endeavor to answer the questions as they come along, but they may be parked and then answered at a later time. So with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Nate Grays.
Thank you, Tim. So let's begin by talking about some of the key players here. We're really talking about 3 different groups: the legislative body, which is, of course, town meeting, the voters, the governing body, which is going to be the select board, and the budget committee. And I do want to mention that, if you've seen prior webinars, and we won't go too much into this, but there are obviously 2 different kinds of budget committees. There's the official budget committee, which falls under the statutory authority for budget committees. And then we have the advisory budget committee, which are the other budget committees, the ones that don't have the official role. But of course, many of you who live in towns with advisory budget committees know that oftentimes they are given some authority, delegated some authority by the governing body. And we really just wanted to cover this basics because, of course, we're talking about the default budget today. And the default budget, the authority to create that is the governing body. So it's not municipal staff, it's not school board staff, it's the governing body who is in charge of creating that, unless that authority has been delegated to the budget committee. And Catherine's going to cover that in a lot more detail in a little bit on how that all works. But I just wanted to begin at the beginning, so to speak. And speaking of the beginning, let's talk a little bit about the SB2 default budget historical timeline, because, of course, it's really important to understand where this comes from. SB2, which is formally under RSA Chapter 40, is a option for a form of government. It's not just, sort of how town meeting works. It's a different form of government. And it's important to keep that in mind, because if you think about traditional town meeting, and I don't mean traditional town meeting where everyone shows up and you all decide, in town hall at that time exactly what's going to happen for the year. But what we call traditional town meeting, which is where you have a governing body that proposes a budget. You show up at the town offices or town hall, and you stay there until you figure out what that budget's going to be. SB2 is different because it allows for voting by ballot. And one of the things you vote for by ballot is, of course, the budget. And obviously, if you go with a traditional warrant article, which this would be a warrant article, you'd show up and you'd vote, and you either vote yes, so it passes, or no, so it doesn't pass. It's a little bit problematic when you're talking about all the money that's used to run all of the town or school things, because, of course, if you vote no and there's no default, there's no other option, the result is nothing happens. There's no money allocated whatsoever. That's really problematic because you can't shut down towns or schools for a year at a time. And it really just would throw everything into chaos. So when SB2 was originally created back in 1995, the idea was to create this default budget, which is basically, hey, last year, the town or the school approved a budget. Obviously, the voters were okay with that. We're going to pull that forward to the next year if they don't like the new proposal. So, you voted in a whole bunch of new local officials. They proposed something just totally wacky. And the voters said, hey, wait a minute, we don't like this. Let's go back to what we did last year. And that worked pretty well. There was some confusion. There were a few court cases that happened back in the late 90s to clarify that. And the term default budget and what was included in that was further refined back in 2004, about 18 years ago. Of course, that's not to say there isn't legislation every year about the default budget. There is. Since 2004, there have been at least 21 bills to redefine what's meant by default budget. A couple of those passed back in 2018. And again, Catherine's going to go into that in more detail. But other than that, none of those other bills were successful. And that's because this is a really complex area. It's very confusing. That's why we're doing a whole hour-plus long webinar on it, the School Boards Association. And we hope at the end of this that you will understand what the default budget is, how it works, and how it's calculated and how it's supposed to be calculated, and some considerations into that, because the language is a bit technical and a bit confusing, especially if you're not a money person like me. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the money person, Catherine.
Thank you, Nate, and thank you for that history. So as we walk through official budget law, RSA 4013, and SB2 as it's known, we just want to continue to keep in mind that when SB2 was created, there was no mechanism for a town or a school, as Nate said, to move forward without either having a special meeting or, as they created, a default. So this was a mechanism that was put into place so that everyone could continue the continuity of government in the event of a no vote. So as Nate mentions, the governing body calculates the default unless that's delegated to the budget committee through the annual meeting authorization. So that delegation would have had to been delegated, and we'll get into how that works later on. The formula is statutorily created, meaning that the default budget can be higher or lower than the proposed budget. That is perfectly valid and reasonable, but there is a statutory formula that we have to use that requires us to reduce or increase, as the case may be, by debt service, contracts, other obligations previously incurred or mandated by law, reduced by one-time expenditures contained in the operating budget, and by salaries and benefits of positions that have been eliminated in the proposed budget, so the budget moving forward. So that is RSA 4013 in a nutshell. And we are going to go through that step by step. So I'm going to, again, reread the definition of a default budget, because this is really, we're going to break down each one of these aspects step by step and piece by piece and go through examples throughout this webinar so we understand all the different facets of how the default is calculated. So again, a default budget means the amount of the same appropriations as contained in the operating budget authorized for the previous year, reduced and increased as the case may be by debt service, contracts, and other obligations previously incurred or mandated by law, and reduced by one-time expenditures contained in the operating budget, and by salaries and benefits of positions that have been eliminated in the proposed budget, so the budget moving forward. So, of course, this occurred in 2018, the most recent definition changes in default budgeting. And the current law has new limits in that it redefines contracts, and we're going to go much more into depth into that. And it also has a provision about presenting the budget prior to the deliberative session. So the terms are, let's define the terms of how we're going to break it down. So what is a one-time expenditure? That is an expenditure not included in the default because they are appropriated and not likely to reoccur. They're not likely to reoccur, and the governing body would determine that unless the town meeting votes to delegate that again to the official budget committee. So anytime we talk about the budget committee throughout this webinar, it does not apply to an advisory budget committee, only official, and only an official committee that's been delegated this authority. Contracts are previously approved, and the amount has to be approved by the legislative body, either in the operating budget authorized for the previous year or in a separate warrant article in the previous year. So again, it had to be voted on by the voter. And eliminated positions for the purposes of the default does not include a vacant position under recruitment or a position redefined in the proposed operating budget. Only a position that has been completely eliminated. It's of note that when they redefined eliminated positions in 2018 under the new law, they're taking out an eliminated positions from the proposed budget, but what they didn't do was allow us to add into the default any proposed new positions. So legislators tend to want the default budget to always be lower than the proposed budget. However, we know due to contracts and obligations, that might not always be the case, or bond issues. And we'll go through all of those examples. So in the 2018, the legislation was the most significant change that had happened since 2004 when the law was clarified. So in 2018, the law made it clear what a contract can be and what that contract can be used to adjust that default number. So contracts, again, have to be previously approved, and the amount has to be approved by the legislative body or the voter. So the language is a little imprecise because the legislative body, as we know, does not actually approve a contract. They don't sit and review a contract. The governing body does that. What the legislative body approves is, or disapproves rather, is the dollar amount or the funding for the contract. So at its most basic level, the default budget is really a bottom line number. It's a bottom line number that the voters have approved, and it has been disclosed in the budget that they approved in the previous year. But the intent of the 2018 legislation was very clear, that the amount included in the contract cannot be adjusted in the default unless it was previously approved by the legislative body. So the default has to have that legislative body approval. So contracts, again, always are going to be limited to those that were approved by the legislative body. So the intent is clear, and we're going to go through some examples later on in the presentation. Some other changes to the default calculation were the discussion of the operating budget and the default budget at deliberative session. So the same law under Chapter 241 and RSA 4013, Roman 4, say that the first session of the annual meeting in an SB2 town shall consist of an explanation, discussion, and debate of warrant articles, including those that pertain to the default budget. So again, we're going to talk about that in a little more depth as we break each area down of the law. And then an additional change was that budget must be reduced in the default by those eliminated positions. So of course, the salaries and benefits of positions that have been eliminated in the proposed budget. So the budget that we're about to propose. So we're kind of going back in time in the default budget, which wasn't the original intent when the law was created in 1995. That was meant to freeze the budget at the dollar amounts and the levels that the legislative body approved. But this law has us now going back in time for eliminated positions. So again, I want to reiterate, those do not include vacant positions or positions under recruitment. So the new law also states that in calculating the default, the governing body must follow the formula, and it can be now higher or lower than the proposed operating budget, because there had been some confusion whether or not the default could ever be higher than the proposed budget. And we'll talk about some of the contracts like collective bargaining and bond issues that could impact the default calculation, making the budget higher in the default calculation. The adjustments must be presented in detail. So Chapter 313 also requires that the budget is presented for questions and discussions at the first budget hearing, and it suggests that something more than just having it available on the side or in a document. It must be presented, so questions must be permitted and discussion. It's important to note the default calculation cannot be modified or changed by the legislative body or the voters. That's a governing body function, but it must be presented and discussed. So the default budget also had a significant change that specific items that constitute a change from the prior year's operating budget by account code must be disclosed, and the reasons for that change must be disclosed. So the voters can understand that either it was contractual, that made it increase, maybe a bond issue perhaps made it increase, a one-time expenditure, or an eliminated position that caused a decrease in the line. So again, we'll get into all that and some examples. I'm just trying to give the broad overview. So generally speaking, at the annual meeting, the voters approve all appropriations. They vote to create the common funds and the district funds for the municipality or the district. They have the authority to propose appropriations by petition. They may amend separate warrant articles to reduce or zero out appropriations in the proposed budget and the proposed warrant. They may amend the proposed budget to reduce or increase the bottom line, and they can zero out line items, right? Warrant articles pertaining to the default budget have to be explained and discussed and open for debate, right? But they may not be amended by the voter. The default may not be amended on the floor of the deliberative session. That's important to note. So let's talk a little bit about the default procedure. Just generally speaking, how do we get our default budget? And how do we get from A to Z? So the preparation and determination of the default budget, including the one-time expenditures, capital project appropriations, contracts, bond issues, it rests with the governing body, that final determination, unless it's been delegated to that official budget committee. It's disclosed and presented at the first budget hearing. The line item changes must be available at the budget hearing. So the appropriations in last year's budget, the reductions and or increases, including identifying the specific items that might have constituted that change in the account codes and the reasons for those change, any one-time expenditures that have been taken out, and any reductions for eliminated positions. You would have the discussion and debate of the default budget at the deliberative session, but the default budget, again, may not be amended by the voter. It's kind of frozen in time. The DRA portal, for those of you who may or may not have any experience in the DRA portal, does allow the preparer of the default, which would be staff. So while staff certainly, so our superintendents, our business administrators, our finance officers, our town managers, our town administrators, well, everyone is certainly helping the governing body calculate the default and making sure that calculation is done correctly. The individual responsible in your organization for entering it into the portal will be able to make those adjustments in the default budget and enter those one-time appropriations, the reductions or the increases. And there's a section for explanatory text that can be provided by account code in the reason field. So that would only be done on the DRA account code line items. And that is available in the DRA portal. And of course, if you go online to the link that I provided, this is forward facing and any member of the public can see this right on the DRA website. And there's several other FAQs as well available for default budgeting right on the DRA's website. So the default budget procedure, some of our commonly asked questions before we get into some really more meaty examples, was how would the determination of the default have been delegated to the official budget committee? So either the town or district meeting voted at the time that they created SB2 to delegate that authority, or at any time they can add a warrant article under RSA 4014B to delegate the determination of the default budget under RSA 3214. So it definitely had to happen by warrant article, either at the time SB2 was adopted in your district or your municipality, or it can be delegated at any time moving forward if the governing body and the budget committee would like to have that option. And then, of course, how is the default budget presented at the annual town or district meeting? Because I've mentioned that a few times now. So again, it's disclosed at the first public hearing under RSA 32.5 for towns, municipalities, or under RSA 197:6 for school districts. So the determination of the default budget, regardless of who it's completed by, they would show those calculations, present it to the voters, and present those line item changes. The governing body must post certified copies of the default budget form and any amended default budget form, if it ever was amended, under RSA 32.5. So of course, the default budget gets posted just like the regular proposed operating budget would. So again, this question comes up, when would a default budget go into effect? So if the proposed operating budget does not pass and the governing body doesn't choose to call a special meeting, which they do have an option of doing, the operating budget, since it failed, now goes into default. So if you're a calendar year municipality, community, and you're on the calendar year, you're voting after your year took place, essentially after that vote is certified, you are in default. If you're a school district or a fiscal year town starting on July 1, the default would begin at the beginning of your fiscal year. So line item transfer authority. This is another really kind of hot question. So Sullivan versus the Town of Hampton Board of Selectmen in 2006 clarified that the default budget creates a bottom line dollar amount. So it's really the line item that the previous budget approved that creates the default. It's not the position, the person in a position, it's the actual dollar amount. So if we always go back to that frozen dollar amount that was approved, the governing body has to remain within that figure if you go into default. And the court ruled that a failure to pass the operating budget would create a change in circumstance that allows the governing body to use their authority to transfer funds under RSA 3210. So this makes it very clear that if you go into default, the governing body is allowed to transfer funds from one line to another to move forward potential policy priorities or contracts that they have to enter into during the year in order to keep government moving. So it's perfectly legal and reasonable for the governing body to use that transfer authority under a default budget situation. So individual warrant articles. When we have individual warrant articles, in most cases, they'll be considered one-time expenses unless it creates a contract. So a one-time expense would say we bought a police cruiser or we bought a backhoe, for example, or a new food service truck for the school district. That's a one-time expense that would not be included in the default. Examples of contracts that would be included in the default would be collective bargaining agreements, multi-year contracts, and lease purchase contracts, as well as bond issues. So there is one exception that I want to point out, that if an SB2 town approves a multi-year appropriation warrant article under capital projects under RSA 32.7, which is a very specific financial tool that can be used, you have up to 5 years to use that appropriation and no further authorization is needed because that's all disclosed in that warrant article. So each year's amount after the first year would automatically be in future years. It's kind of like a very mini bond, if you want to look at it that way, for the 5-year duration would go into the default calculation. So that is one exception of a warrant article that could potentially, that is a contract, that would be an exception that would be included in the default in subsequent years. So a warrant article versus the operating budget, some commonly asked questions that we get. So what's the risk associated with putting the full term of a contract, a multi-year contract, to the voter in a separate warrant article? So the most obvious is a no means no trigger, meaning if the voters vote it down and it's a separate warrant article, you're not allowed to appropriate any monies for that purpose. However, a well-crafted warrant article may help to reduce the risk of a no means no being triggered. Is the purpose of the no means no the spending, or if you can find another spending source, Or is the no means no, that they don't want the item, proposal, or project that you're entering into that contract for? So I think a carefully worded warrant article can help mitigate against no means no and not being able to have a multi-year contract placed into the default in future years. And what is the risk associated with putting the amount in a default budget? So there are many types of multi-year agreements or contracts signed by the select board or the school board or their designees. And this is usually the best approach, but it doesn't mean it's the only approach. Warrant articles, again, can be used. But it does mean that the default budget cannot include increases that the select board may be basically on the hook to pay. So it's only the bottom line amount, again, approved by the voters at the previous meeting. However, we'll get into some real specific examples. In this case, the governing body would be able to use their transfer authority. So as we move forward, we'll talk about more specific examples. So what are contracts and other obligations previously incurred or mandated by law that we would consider or have to include in the default? So again, the cost of any multi-year contract that was approved by the voter. One of the best examples is a collective bargaining agreement that we have either with our school employees or our town employees. That is approved by the voter and therefore carried forward for the duration of that contract into future defaults. So other multi-year contracts that were disclosed or discussed at the town or district meeting could include a lease payment. It could include certainly a bond payment. So those are some other examples because it was placed specifically on the warrant and approved by the voters. Obligations that are mandated by law that would be included would be something like workman's compensation, which is required by RSA Chapter 281A. New Hampshire retirement, right? They have to, our Group 1 teachers and our Group 2 fire and police must be into the retirement system if they're full-time. County payments or payments to the state treasurer, a town's payment to the school district, for example, are obligations required by law. So those would be included in the default calculation. So we'll talk about some examples of contracts now, some very specific examples. So if a town meeting voted last year or 2 years ago to approve cost items in a collective bargaining agreement that was appropriately Sanbornized, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, Sanbornizing is a term derived from the case of appeal from the Sanborn Regional School District in 1990, that sufficient disclosure to the legislative body of the cost items in a collective bargaining agreement or multi-year agreement becomes binding by the municipality. So that's what Sanbornized means. If that agreement includes those increases, it would be automatically applied to the default because it was disclosed. Now, here's an example of where we would not include funds into the default. So if you have a budget that you're using your trash hauling, waste hauling services, that was $400,000. And mid-year, the contract had to change for whatever the reason or terms, or perhaps it's a mid-year renewal, and it went up to $450,000 for the same service, for level services for the subsequent year. You cannot include the extra $50,000 in the proposed default, in the default budget rather. It's in the proposed operating budget, right, in the proposal to the voters, but it cannot go into the default calculation because that mid-year contract was not approved by the voter. So again, we have to go back to that $400,000 number. And of course, we're going to have trash hauling services. It's very important for health, public safety, just general government. We have to get rid of our municipal waste. So of course, the selectmen or governing body would have to find the funds under 3210 to transfer if you went into a default situation, only in the event that the operating budget wasn't approved and you had to go into default. So salaries and raises, this is one of the more complicated areas. So the Hillsborough Superior Court found that annual salary increases included in employment contracts entered into between a town employee and the select board or the governing body, school board, could not be included in the future default budget. The judge in that case determined that the appropriations were not previously approved by the voters and did not constitute a contract under the default law. So this is Kirk versus Clow back in 2019 after the 2018 law had been passed. So this means that employee raises provided after the annual meeting that are not disclosed and approved in the salary line item at the annual meeting should not be included in the default unless they're required by a legally binding previously ratified contract or the municipality is going to fill that position at certain wages and they're required to do so. Another area to be cognizant of is that separate warrant articles containing merit raises, a COLA, or other compensation are considered one-time expenses, right? Because one town meeting does not bind to the next unless it's a multi-year contract. So if it's only for 1 year, those also would have to be carefully worded because they cannot carry forward into defaults in subsequent years. Again, we're only talking about the default budget. All of this would go into your proposed budget, which hopefully your voters will pass. So some examples of contracts not approved at the annual meeting. So what happens when the select board did not submit a contract to the voters in a separate meeting? So here's a very specific example. So in 2022, a budget contained the $100,000 for the waste hauling. The 2023 contract is set to increase by 5% or go to $105,000. So the 2023 default budget can again only contain $100,000. That was the dollar amount approved in the previous year's budget. So not the 105, but only the 100. Again, we have to go back to what the voters approved in that line item in the previous year. It's the dollar amount approved. In this scenario, whether the operating budget or default budget is adopted, it's the bottom line, and the select board again would have the authority to transfer. So in this case, if you went into default, the board would have to find $5,000 somewhere else in the budget. But we do have to be cognizant that somewhere else in the budget could suffer during that line item transfer, right? Because we have to take away from something else. So that is an example of a contract not approved at the annual meeting because it occurred mid-year or wasn't on a separate warrant article. So the default budget must be reduced for eliminated positions. Again, this is excluding salaries, attrition, and retirement and reorganization. So in 2018, when the law was passed, we went back and looked at the testimony. It indicated that excluded salaries and the specific terms did not include the vacant positions or positions being reorganized or restructured. 2018 testimony, when the law changed, also acknowledged when a position is not eliminated, but just replaced by new employees, even with a new and lower salary, like maybe due to retirement, a more junior person with less experience takes on the role, those changes do not need to be adjusted or reflected in the default budget. Supporters of the 2018 law changes maintain that if a position remains open or is filled by a more junior employee, the default would not need to be adjusted. They recognized at the time that there were timing issues when we develop a budget versus when we adopt a budget and all the things that transpire throughout the year. So that was acknowledged and vetted during the law change in 2018. So again, only if the position is going to be eliminated through attrition, reorganization, or restructuring does it have to be removed from the default budget. So only in the proposed budget, if you're eliminating that position, would it be eliminated in the default. So here are some examples of salary increases. And this is another commonly debated and frequently asked question about the default budget. So the example is an employee whose salary and benefits package, that would include health and retirement, payroll taxes, right? That's all the cost associated with that employee. So the governing body entered into an agreement with this employee to pay a 10% increase. For the 2023 default, the board cannot include the 10% increase. It can only include, and I'm just looking at my math mistake, it should have been 110. I'm a math person. Must have had that waste hauling. I apologize. I'll fix that on the slide. They cannot include that because the employee, that agreement wasn't vetted in the annual town meeting, right? They entered into a contract mid-year and it wasn't a multi-year agreement entered into by the voter. So that increase again would not go into the default. So we have to be really careful with how we structure. Just because we have a contract in the back office with an employee, we have to be careful if we are SB2 on how we enter into those contracts and what's presented to the voters to ensure that salary increases can be carried forward into future default budgets.
Hey, Catherine,
Nate.
before you move on, we have a couple questions that came up that are somewhat relevant to the example you just gave.
Yes.
People were really interested in liability insurance and health insurance increases and whether those would be qualified as obligations mandated by law, whether they could be included in the default budget, or how exactly those play into that when they see that happening to employees. So if you could just address that. That would be
so unfortunately, health insurance increases, health insurance and all the different available packages that we can offer our employees is not mandated by law and H. So those increases would not be able to be carried into future, only in the proposed budget, but not into the default. So it's only things like workers' compensation or New Hampshire retirement that are required by law. However, this is a bit of a gray area because that goes along with their benefits, right? So there's not clarity in the law on when they talk about an employee's benefits. So one could make the argument that it's part of their benefits package and therefore it can be carried into the default, but we don't have an RSA specifically stating that it's a legal obligation. I know Attorney Phillips is on the call and maybe he would like to weigh in on that.
I just wanted to add the clarification that if you have a collective bargaining agreement that requires you to pay benefits, then those benefits would fall within the contract provision. So I just wanted to add that sort of nuance.
It would be an obligation previously incurred by law. If you had a 3-year collective bargaining agreement, the voters approved that contract that was properly Sanbornized. The second year, your health insurance rates are going up 10%. We would take the position that the collective bargaining agreement is an obligation previously incurred by law, and therefore that 10% increase could be included in the default budget.
Well, even if the contract wasn't Sanbornized, the requirement to continue health insurance benefits falls within the status quo doctrine.
Yeah.
So it gets continued whether or not you have a CBA that's you've reached impasse and you're in status quo or it's been Sanbornized, either way.
Thank you. So I definitely would agree with that in the case of collective bargaining agreements. However, we have a lot of towns where maybe only a few people or one person has a health insurance package. So I would maintain, though, that is a benefit, but it's really the line items. We kind of have to go back to that approved line item. It's really a dollar amount in a line that we have to consider when we talk about the default budget, when we're talking outside of contracts, because a default budget is about a dollar amount approved in a line item. So if you approved $100,000 for health insurance, that's what was previously approved by the voter. So again, there's some gray areas that continue within the law that don't shed a lot of clarity around some of these more nuanced benefits, because there's certainly other benefits as well that we offer to our employees. So it's the dollar amount in the law. Do you have another one, Nate?
Not at the moment that's relevant to the discussion, but I guess I was just going to chime in here and tell our attendees that if you're talking about unionized employees, it certainly seems to be the case that there are perhaps some special rules. And if there are questions, you ought to consult with your attorney to make sure that you're following both the terms of the contract that was voted on previously, as well as the existing law for calculating things like the default budget.
Thank you very much. Okay, so moving into the default must be reduced for eliminated positions. So we'll talk about a more specific example. So the assistant public works director retired, and a decision was made by that community that they would not be filling the position. So the position would be discontinued when the employee retired. So the amount of money in last year's operating budget that represented the salary and benefits and a cost associated with that position would not be included in the upcoming year's default in that case. However, in the case where the town intended to fill an assistant public works position, but it was just vacant because a search was being conducted, the amount of money associated with that position would be included because there's an intention to continue with the position. And in the third example, if the town intends to fill the assistant public works director and a successful search was conducted, but the employee was maybe less experienced and started at a lower salary, the total amount of money still associated with that position under the 2018 law changes would allow you to continue that because it was the approved line item that would be in the default budget. So let's talk about examples of some one-time expenditures, because this is, again, another area of the law that can get a little confusing. We're only talking about one-time expenditures contained in the operating budget, because, again, those separate warrant articles that are one-time expenditures would automatically not be included. Only those contracts that we talked about would be. So when we talk about the operating budget, we'll just use the example of the town put in the operating budget money to replace the windows in the town hall or in the school building, for example. Since window installation is a discrete project and it occurred, it would be considered a one-time expenditure. That's not something we do every year. It's not regular, like getting an oil change, on our vehicles. That would be considered a one-time expense. It's a capital expense. Hopefully those windows last 15 to 20 to more years. So that's a one-time expense. Another example would be an exterior improvement, such as installing a handicap access ramp. That would be considered a one-time expense. The purchase of a backup generator for, say, the fire station would likely be a non-reoccurring one-time expense. So those are some examples of one-time expenses that have to be removed from the default budget if they were contained in the operating budget. So some examples of adjustments to the default budget being presented in detail. So the example here is that if in the prior year's operating budget, you included an amount in the police budget to buy land for a future expansion, right? And that reduction for that expenditure would be identified when you're calculating the default and placed in that DRA line and disclosed to the voters. Another example would be if a position in the highway department was eliminated, the amount of the reduction would be shown and explained that the position was eliminated this year and disclosed to the voters. So commodities and utilities, this is another really common example where we go back to that basic premise of it's the approved amount of the line item from the previous year. So we all know we have inflationary pressures and the cost of electricity and fuel oil, gasoline, diesel are all going up exponentially, such as the cost of a kilowatt hour, or maybe it's even the cost per ton for asphalt. The default budget includes the amount that was appropriated, not the amount that we know it's going to cost in the upcoming year. So this is, again, a little bit unfortunate because we know about these inflationary pressures. We can't apply those increases, that inflation, to the default budget. So the default budget is really limited to the same amount of appropriations in the previous year's operating budgets, right? So it's really important to note that, especially since we're entering into budget season where we know we have significant rates of inflation, although I know the feds are announcing today where we're at. So hopefully we'll have some good news by the end of today.
Catherine, I actually do have a relevant question. Came up a little bit earlier, but for those people who are staff people and they're in charge of entering the default budget into the DRA portal or other accounting software, and they look at something like the utilities line and the select board says, okay, we know looking at the default budget, we know we're going to have to increase the utilities line pretty significantly because of the cost of energy going up. So we're going to prepare departments by saying, hey, everybody take a 10% cut or whatever the case is, and we're going to move that over to the energy line. When that person is uploading to the DRA portal and updating stuff in their accounting software, are they supposed to enter the default budget as originally calculated, or after the select board decides to move those lines around?
So the default budget, the line item transfers are going to occur after the meeting occurs and after the governing body has decided not to call a special town meeting, and when the default takes effect. And once the default takes effect, those line item transfers are recorded just like you would in your regular budget cycle. So they're not recorded anywhere previously, only moving forward once you've entered into that fiscal year budget time. So, and it certainly wouldn't be put on any of the DRA forms. Those dollars are the dollars. The transfers would occur in the accounting software in the current budget cycle, not on a DRA form. Does that
Thank you.
answer the question, I hope?
It does, yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. So no new budget lines is another area that we have to be careful of in the default, because we can't add new purposes into a default budget. So only the purposes or the lines that currently exist or appeared in the previous year budget can be included. So an example of that would be if there was no appropriation in the account for number 45152, that's the revaluation of property line on the DRA. You cannot add money into the default, even if you know that you have to do that revaluation of property that year. So it does not fall within the definition of the default calculation. So it's important to note that. So no new lines can be added into the default. Some other commonly asked questions that we get regularly. So our annual meeting is in March, and our governing body provided a 4% COLA to employees in September due to inflation, so the previous September, using the line item transfer authority. Can we include the COLA and the associated payroll taxes and increases to New Hampshire retirement in the salary lines in the default? And unfortunately, again, the answer is no, because that was entered into after the town meeting. It wasn't disclosed to the voter, and the monies aren't available in that line item. So if there were adjustments made to the salaries after the annual meeting, the total amount approved in the line at the annual meeting is really the amount available. So again, we should really be very cognizant and careful if we're SB2 on how we're entering into these agreements with employees and how we're presenting them to preserve those raises for our employees. So another commonly asked question is that you're a calendar year community. So January 1st is the start of your fiscal year, and we voted to add a part-time employee to the transfer station beginning in July. So halfway through the year, you're adding an employee. If we go into default, can all 12 months of salary be included in the default since the position was approved by the voter? So unfortunately, again, in the 2023 default, only 26 weeks of salary was approved by the voter. And we go back to the line item, right? We have the line that was approved. So unfortunately, only 26 weeks can be added into the default. So not the full 52 weeks. However, the position can be maintained by the authority of the governing body to transfer funds under RSA 3210. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Nate for a moment, and then we'll take some questions.
Well, thank you, Catherine. There's some questions queuing up. So just to kind of summarize the 30 or so slides that Catherine just went over, really the default budget is what happened at last year's town meeting. Freezes, then you take off the one-time expenditures, add in those, long-term contracts, the collective bargaining agreements, any of those increases in there, and that's it. And unfortunately, that does put towns into a hard position when they're trying to figure out, because they know that some things like energy costs are changing, or they've hired someone throughout the year, et cetera. So that's always something to keep in mind as you go forward in your budget cycle and plan for what the needs are for the municipality, and whether, if you go to default, that's something that you could actually afford to maintain, or whether that's something that's going to put the municipality into a crunch. So let's talk very briefly about the future of the default budget before we move on to our questions. And so I just want to mention, because I am the lobbyist here on many of these issues, that changes to the default budget bills are proposed pretty much every year to those. Again, sometimes we see some changes, sometimes we don't. It's obviously impossible to predict the future as to what will get passed. But really, as I mentioned, the default budget is supposed to be what was approved last year, taking out kind of those extras and adding in anything that the voters reasonably understood were going to be added in. So they knew when they passed the collective bargaining agreement that it was going to include a 3% raise for everybody the next year, et cetera. And so it wasn't ever really designed initially as a tax reduction mechanism. It's just a formula for keeping the towns and the schools running in case, they can't come up with a solution during deliberative session for, adjustments to the proposed budget that is palatable to the voters. And the thing that we see, or we've seen filed over the past probably 5 or so years, and certainly Barrett can chime in here. He's been doing this a little bit longer than I have, so I'm relying mostly on our legislative bulletins and notes that were passed on to me, is that there's a lot of interest in the legislature to figure out a way to cause the default budget to be reduced if the proposed budget is lower than the default budget. So you see this sometimes when there are, big projects in town that have been funded over a long period of time, or significant changes in staffing, that type of thing, where for whatever reason the budget committee, and if there is one, and the governing body working together have come up with an idea for how to save some money. The proposed budget is less than last year's budget, so obviously that means that the taxpayers will be paying a bit less. And so the legislature has really been exploring different ways to try to cause the default budget to reflect those changes. And that's really what we saw happen in 2018. I think that's a fair characterization of that. And we'll see what happens going forward. Obviously, the default budget is a legislative creation, and it's entirely possible for municipalities to change exactly how they're structured. So, for example, I live in a city, and so I go and vote for representatives who go and deal with this. There's no default budget calculation. It's always possible for towns to leave the SB2 system and require everyone to go back in a room together and figure out exactly what they want to pay for this year. So there are different options there as well. And kind of as we see the legislature look at possible changes and potentially pass possible changes, those are always things for you as municipalities to consider as well. With that, perhaps we should answer some questions.
Yes, that sounds good. I think the first one I'm going to toss over to the school boards, because it's about transportation, as schools are mandated to have elementary transportation. And this question is, they have a multi-year contract with our transportation company. We had it in the operating budget, but not as a separate warrant article. Would increases still be in the default?
I'd say that's a contract. You have a continuing obligation within the definition of the default budget. If it's a 5-year transportation contract and it calls for a 5% increase every year, even though that contract itself was not approved specifically or directly by the voters, the district is still has an obligation to it's a what's the language again? The obligation previously incurred by law.
Right. And they have a mandated obligation by law to transport the elementary students, right? That's
right
in the law.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let me add a nuance to that. Many districts if not most, provide more transportation than is required by law. So the mere fact that you entered a 5-year contract, if that contract provided transportation beyond what was required by law, it might be trickier for you to include that portion of the increases. There's a lot of variables that might impact that. I mean, you might be able to. There's circumstances in each district that might strengthen the argument that you can include the non-required costs, but you really have to look at the circumstances. So, for instance, if the Department of Education has ordered that you provide greater transportation than the minimum of the statute, then that would be required by law. There's a provision in the statute that if the area that the child is being transported from is or would otherwise walk from is not safe to walk, then the district can be required to provide the transportation, in which case that would now trigger the required by law requirement. So anyway, you have to look very closely at your contracts. If you're a K through 6 district, and you only provide transportation for children who live 2 miles away or further, then all of those costs can be included. But anything beyond that, you have to look closely at the circumstances.
Thank you very much, Will. Our next question is, what if a position is eliminated and it'll be replaced by a similarly structured position, but the replacement position does not maintain the exact same title? Does anybody want to weigh in on that one, or should?
Well, I think you kind of covered that in one of your previous slides, Catherine. I don't know if you want to skip back there.
Sure. Let's see if I can get to it. Oh, wait. Oh, yep. I think it's this slide. Oh, sorry about that, everyone. So if a position is eliminated through attrition, reorganization, or restructuring, it does have to be removed from the default budget, unfortunately. So again, we want to be cognizant and careful, because the law does not allow us to put positions that we're proposing, which in many cases, right, we're having to create a new position to fill a need in the community or the school district. Perhaps it could even be required by law need in the school district. For example, in the case of maybe special education, that would fall under required by law. However, if you're creating a new position, it does have to be removed because it doesn't allow us to put proposed new positions into the default. It doesn't allow us to go back in time with additions, only eliminations. Our next question is, regarding one-time expenses, our library makes minor upgrades every year, and each year the there's types of changes within the line. Is this considered a one-time expense, even though we budget a similar amount every year for minor upgrades? I would say if you're doing regular maintenance, if that's what you're talking about, there's maintenance lines. Regular maintenance is anticipated and expected, and we have to maintain a certain level in order to have our buildings and our properties be safe and accessible and usable by our constituents. So I would think that in that case, that would be acceptable. When we talk about things like oil changes and getting new tires, maybe we don't get them every year, but we certainly have to have tires in order to have a piece of equipment. I think those fall into the maintenance line. If you're talking about minor things, the one-time expenditures seem to be more capital expenditures that are really one-time in nature. Like we don't replace windows every year, for example. We don't replace a roof every year. That tends to be more of a one-time expense. We don't build a new building every year or buy a piece of land every year. Those are one-time expenses.
If I could add to that too, I think part of it is going to depend on what line item you're purchasing these things from. If it's a general office supply line item where you buy the computer and you buy the chair and you buy your paper, I don't think you have to worry about, okay, last year you bought 50 cases of paper and this year you can only buy 49. I think the bottom line of number of that line item is going to be determinative, and you have flexibility on what to buy and how to expend within that line item. One year it might be a new computer, next year it might be a new printer, depending on your office needs. But I think that's what you need to look at, not so much what you're purchasing, but what line item and how much you're spending, with consideration of the one-time expenditures as well, too, as you explained, Catherine.
Thank you very much.
I think to keep in mind, too, not to say you shouldn't go into that detail, but to keep in mind, too, the one-time expenditures that the legislature really focused on were those big ticket items, the new truck, the new building, the new, the things that add money to the tax bill. The 50 reams of paper versus 49 is probably not something that you necessarily have to go into that detailed of, although certainly if you have the wherewithal to do it, you're the money person like Catherine, you will. But for the rest of us, probably not.
No, I would fully agree. I think they're capital items that can probably be depreciated to some extent, that you would be recording on your assets, right? So I don't think that they're talking about these small items that we need for our day-to-day operations year over year. I think they're talking about these bigger ticket items, to your point, Neej.
And I see the next question is for me. So will the legislation preventing proposed budgets from being less than default budgets have any chance of passing this upcoming legislative session? I believe the legislation was inspired by the Croydon situation. I couldn't speak to what the inspiration was there. If I had a crystal ball and I could tell you, I would love to be able to tell you where all the bills are going this year and where I need to focus my attention. But we'll have to wait and see what happens at the public hearings.
All right. The next question is, if the voters vote for a default budget and it does not include funding for whatever might be needed for the future, and no other line can reduce their lines, could the town district hold a special meeting to appropriate additional funds to the current operating budget? Yes, the town can hold a special meeting. Of course, there's costs associated with that, but it is up to the governing body to decide if they want to hold a special meeting. Do you have anything to add, Barrett or Will?
Nope.
Okay. If we have language that says we can only pay the increases in the contract if the operating budget is approved, do we not have to put in the default? If we have language that says we can only pay the increases in the contract.
So I assume what's meant here is that I'm going to say it's a collective bargaining agreement, and they say if the operating budget next year is approved, as part of that, we'll put in the 3% increase, and therefore we'd have to pay the increase. So I assume if your collective bargaining agreement says we only pay the increase if, we're required to put that 3% increase in the operating budget and we'll pay it if it's in there, it wouldn't be the same for the default because the default's what happens when the operating budget fails. So you don't have to.
But the default, so we'll just use a strange scenario that a collective bargaining agreement passed because the community really values its teachers, which is really important. But the budget itself failed, right? And the subsequent year, the collective bargaining agreement, even if they're in default for 3 years, that CBA continues and is added into the default, even with those increases year over year over year, because those voters approved that collective bargaining agreement or that contract, even if you're in a default situation, because the voters approved that contract.
I think they might be asking beyond the collective bargaining agreement. It's not uncommon for municipal and school district contracts that are multi-year contracts to have appropriation clauses. They're required, I think, for long-term leases, but it's many municipal and school attorneys would ask that those provisions be included in multi-year contracts, because the mere fact that a governing body signs a long-term contract doesn't bind the future annual meetings to those expenditures. So I think the answer might depend on the particular contract, collective bargaining agreement, for instance, or whether it's simply your transportation contract or something like that. But a non-appropriation clause usually, says something to the effect of, either party can terminate if the funds aren't appropriated, or the parties will go back to the table or something like that.
So I guess
better known as the municipal escape clause, right? That's how we call it.
There you go.
The municipal escape clause, we call it.
It's been a while.
I guess I'll just throw in here that if you have a very specific question about a specific contract, it would be better for you to contact the appropriate, either the school boards or us offline, and we can follow up with you on that.
Yes, I think I agree. Definitely, if you have very specific questions, please contact the School Board Association, your own local attorney, the New Hampshire Municipal Association, and we can kind of walk through your more specific example. The next question is, if you add a new line to the budget and transfer the money from an old line to the new line, is this okay to change in the default? Again, we'll go back to, even though it's the same dollar amount, it is the line that was approved at the annual meeting that the default is calculated on, not any of the transfers that occurred during the course of the year.
Right. You can't authorize a new purpose for spending money. You're limited to whatever purposes were passed at the prior town meeting.
Correct. But once that default takes effect, as the courts ruled, the governing body then can take on the line item transfer function and move the funds around, and we would account for them appropriately through either the governing body vote or through the manifest system or whatever system that you use to track line item transfers. And the current budget would reflect those transfers and when they occurred throughout the year, for the transparency required that the voters can see how monies were changed around, but certainly allowable. All right, so the next question is, let's say the 2022 approved operating budget included step increases of 2% and a COLA of 3% for all non-union staff beginning on 7/1 on a calendar year municipality. Are the 2023 default budget salary lines calculated on the new rates that went into effect on 7/1, or the default budget based on the total amount of each salary line? So again, unfortunately, we go back to the 7/1 date because you're a calendar year municipality, so you only budgeted for half of the year. So while you only taxed your voters on the half a year, and that increase, because those wages weren't retroactive and covering all 52 weeks of the year, you cannot include it in the default because it's the dollar amount that was approved, not the intent, which is of course to give the staff the agreement. So you basically have half of what you approved to carry forward into the new year for that COLA and 3%. You don't have the full amount because it's the line item dollar amount, unfortunately. All right. Oh, and I just lost the last question I saw up.
I just answered that.
Great.
It was about non-SB2 towns. So I just clarified that, if you are, default budgets only apply to SB2. It does not apply to non-SB2 municipalities. They would not calculate a default budget because that's not an option for them.
Great. Well, I do want to thank Will and Barrett for being here on this call and helping answering these questions. This is complicated for sure. The default calculation is not simple. That's why we are trying to have a webinar, kind of go through some of the logistics. There are going to be a lot of nuances involved and a lot of thought that has to go into this. So certainly contact us at the New Hampshire Municipal Association, the School Board Association, your local attorney to kind of walk through that calculation. We're certainly here to support you. And we did want to mention that We have the 2023 legislative preview webinar coming up, and I know the School Board Association will have one as well, and we'll let them announce that. Barrett, do you have one as well you want to talk about?
We do. It's that week. If you give me, I want to say it's that Wednesday following the new year, but give me 2 seconds and I'll be able to pull it up on our
Yeah, you can
district's
go
website.
on nhsba.org and look at their events.
nhsba.org.
Yeah,
Yep.
look at their
And
events.
it's scheduled for January 6th from noon until 1:30. I believe that's the Friday following the new year.
So thank you very much, Barrett. If you want to follow what's going on at the legislature from starting in January, that won't culminate until June with schools and school-related matters or with all municipal-related matters, please join us to hear about the legislation that impacts us all respectively, or maybe listen to both, right? It's pretty fascinating, right?
Catherine, can I just jump in real quick?
Yes, of course, Tim.
Before we do the final slide, I just wanted to remind our attendees that we will be wrapping this up into a YouTube recording. We'll be sending that out with the PowerPoint presentation and a list of the Q&A that was part of this discussion webinar thread today. I did want to inform our attendees that this is the last of the webinar series in 2022. We thank you for joining us for these series, and as Catherine just indicated, we'll be bringing back the 2023 webinar series on Monday, January 9th, 2023. So we hope that you join us for that. We all wish you all a happy and prosperous holiday season. And I would like to give final thanks to Catherine H., Barrett, and Will today for their presentation and the Q&A that I think was very valuable. So thank you. You can take it away from here, Catherine.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank all the attendees who stuck with us. I know this was an hour and almost 15 minutes. Thank you for your time. We appreciate all of our members. I know the NHSBA does as well. And our contact information is here on the last slide. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have questions that you're thinking of after the fact. I know it was a lot of information, and we wish you all very happy, healthy 2023 and happy holidays. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Happy holidays, everyone.
If you've got a couple, why don't we do that, and then we'll get public questions and see what we can answer. If not, we will ask a question. Brian?
So one I had was, if we posted a position last year with a certain job description, can we post a different job description for the same monies that were put aside for that position in 2022? So if we advertise for an engineer in 2023, can we change that to an assistant department head in 2024?
I believe we can. I think the trouble with that becomes in the 2025 budget, it may not be part of the default from what I understood.
Yeah, that's one that's sticky that I think we need to look at. Another one I saw was in our default budget, did we make sure that if someone was hired or there was rate changes in the middle of the year that it was reflected, because they said that we cannot follow through with that higher rate in 2024. So if somebody got a raise or got hired in July, the money is only there for them from July on for this year. It's not there for the whole year.
And that's the one I picked up. I thought we hired a firefighter half year.
And if you look at your default budget, that was removed from the default budget.
Okay, because we just get the totals here. I don't have the backup.
Okay. I'm just making, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you
that one came out.
if
Okay.
you in your book, there is a series of line item or adjustments, and if you look at it, 2023 half-year firefighter reduction of $37,904, and then we had half a year of a firefighter for 2024 with a new position coming on at the estimated at $55,000. That was backed out as well in the calculation of the default budget. So yes, that half-year position was backed out, and the new position was as well backed out.
Okay, excellent. How about they were talking about the increase in insurances for non-union employees.
Yeah, that's the other one I had.
Yeah, because they're saying that we're not allowed to give them, or we don't have that money available for us, only for collective bargaining agreements and unionized employees. So I don't know how we handle that.
And I think that's something we want to ask, because they were playing around with whether it was part of your benefit packet. And so I think if we didn't take it out, we should probably.
It's a valid question. Of course, when the default budget is built, you only get the gross numbers. So I've got the gross numbers here. I'm going to have to do a little bit of research on that to get the definitive answer, because that's a hybrid. It involves a multitude of employees under collective bargaining agreements and not. So
When I'm saying, I looked at that, I couldn't tell whether you had, because the
Correct.
collective bargain goes in, because it's part of the contract, where the non-union, I don't think can.
Yeah, so I need to do a little
That's
bit of
kinda what
research on that one.
I think the collective bargaining thing, I wouldn't say it's solved. It's in their contract. It's a valid contract.
Correct.
The question is, again, I think Brian asked it appropriately, is for those employees who are not covered by a collective bargaining agreement, the increase in the cost of benefits, is that going to be shouldered by the town, or because was it pulled out of the default budget and not included in the default budget? And if the answer to that is yes, then those costs have to be shouldered someplace in the town, or the town says we can't. So do we have an answer to that one, or is that a research question?
That's a research question.
Okay, good, thanks. Because that could be a big number, a modest number.
Solid waste contract, is that a contract that had a stipulation of an increase on our tipping fees?
The tipping fee?
There's 173,586 that's added. Is that, do we have a contract? Is that?
I believe that was based on the predetermined contract,
A predetermined contract, okay.
pre-approved contract.
I'm catching up on this. So we had a contract for tipping fees prior to the default budget, and we'll say that's X. The new contract was X plus 15, 18, pick a percentage. Is the plus in the default budget the percentage plus up, or is it not?
It is in the
It
default.
is. Okay, good.
Do you know of any other contracts that we engaged in the middle of the year that weren't part of the operating budget from the year before? Was there anything that we can think of? A lease agreement, something like that? I mean, Peter Ford's lease agreement or something?
That's not applicable.
No,
That's
it's
a
not.
revenue.
It's revenue
Okay.
in.
Has nothing to do with the
expense out.
default
All
budget.
right, okay.
Jim, just back to that, the tipping fee or the solid waste. So how would that be different than the prior question, which was on insurance? You're saying that that increased price for the tipping fees is in the budget, whereas the increased price for insurance may not be in the budget. We don't know.
I've got to do research on that.
But if you found that one was yes and one was no, wouldn't that be kind of a, huh?
Well, and
One's the same contract.
I think that we saw that as well. They had split opinions
Yep.
on that.
They
Lawyers.
said that was a gray area. So I
Absolutely.
think we just probably should have some. I see on here that there other approved labor, $563,813, and it says 100s. That's the 100 series?
Salaries?
Well, and it's an addition. Is that where we put the increases from our contracts? Like our union contracts?
Bargaining agreements?
It doesn't say
So is that
bargaining.
like an accrual?
I just don't know. It's, where the itemize in each of the area. It says 100, so I'm, And we see that, so is that the
I mean,
labor
I would have
increases?
to go through and pull the 100s and
That may
look
be-
at them as a holistic item to see where those increases fall. So that's a research
Okay,
item.
Linda, if I could?
yep.
Unrelated, but related, do we have a guideline or a kind of something we can hang our hat on that says, at what point does an unfilled position become empty? In other words, it's no longer a position. Is
Yeah,
it a-
if we advertise it for 2 years and it's not filled, doesn't
not-
exist
not-
anymore.
not- Yeah, at one point, you say I have an unfilled position, an individual left a job, it's unfilled, and, we could use that unfilled for budget purposes, but at what point maybe that's a policy of this board, at what point do we say it's gone, it just no longer exists?
Well, if you're still advertising for it, then it.
So the trigger would be, or your counsel would be,
Yeah.
let's keep advertising for it.
Well, if we've been
Because that means you're
advertising
actively
it.
searching.
Well, if there's advertising because we believe there's a need for it and we haven't found anybody to fill the position, it stays. If we're just hanging it there and we think we may someday fill it, that's something very different. You're just holding a position because you might want to fill it.
And you'd watch, Jim would watch those.
I think it would take
And we
a
would
vote
watch
of a
it too.
board, take a vote of a board to eliminate a position
Correct.
too, wouldn't it? Until we do that, then the position stays open, the way I would see it.
I think we're going to have to look to see how easily it's going to be to take money and decide if we want to have an assistant town manager instead of an engineer, but it was advertised for a year as an engineer.
And assistant town manager, I think, is the last one that was
Yeah.
up.
So can we swap it back to an engineer? Because I don't know. I think
I think that is a question.
that is a question.
Yep, no, I think that's a question.
Well, it's still in an engineer line, so.
Yeah.
Right?
So you're
It's
saying
still,
you can
it's
call it
still
whatever you
line,
want, but
it's
on a
still
called
line
an
in a
engineer.
budget line item called town engineer.
Town engineer, call it
just-
anything you want.
We're just kind of morphing the job description for it.
Got it.
Find the person.
I don't know if we
to fit
can
it.
hire an assistant town manager if there's a line item for a town engineer. That's what I'm saying.
Well,
Call them
we-
anything you
Well,
want.
it's been approved. So at this point, you can do line item transfers to anything you want as the Board of Selectmen. The trouble becomes the 2025 budget. If you go default again, is that gone? Which my interpretation is, it may be.
Okay. Did everybody find this
I
valuable?
also
Yeah.
have some questions out there, so when we're done asking questions.
Yeah, I thought there was a lot of good information there,
Yep, I think so.
pertinent to what we've seen, so.
Yeah.
Even if we only gain 4 or 5 little pieces out of it that we didn't know before, they can be 4 or 5 little important pieces.
Oh, yeah.
Can I ask Jim to give me one? Jim, can you give me like a different iteration, not a different iteration, but just try that one again on the town engineer, town manager default budget? That thing could go away. Could you help me with that? I wasn't following that.
From what I understood, what they presented was you as the Board of Selectmen can do the line item transfers to whatever you want. If you transfer those funds for a town engineer into something else, that would be a new line item. That new line item is not part of the default budget. Therefore, does that go away under reorganization as part of 2025, or does it default back to the existing town engineer line?
And I thought I heard, and maybe I got to go back and read up on this, I thought I heard you're not supposed to create new line items.
That's what I thought I heard.
So let's do the extreme. Kind
You
of
can transfer from line item to line item. I mean, you're right. You can't create new line items.
So let's do the extreme. You have an unfilled position or position called engineer, and you create a new position called Parks and Recreation maintenance person. I think I heard you couldn't do that.
I agree with you.
So we just want to make sure we do some, maybe some thinking on that one. I don't know. Yeah, I thought you heard you couldn't create new line items.
And with regards to all line item transfers that we did last year in 2023, those had to be filtered out of the default budget, and UNKC filtered those all out.
So when we start the default budget is started from the approved budget.
22. Yeah.
And the tricky part with DRA is the DRA portal only gives you a gross number for each department. That's why they said when you get into your accounting software, that's where you got to get into line by line by line by line to be able to determine what are those one-time expenditures and back those out.
Okay.
That's why when you sign the default budget, you just get a gross number, and we don't have a default budget created within the accounting software.
Yep. So the last one I have is, they said, and I might not understand this, they said that there's supposed to be line item transferred, line item changes presented at the budget hearing. And that's what I was talking to John and Bob about. And I'm like, do we ever bring those forward? They said it at least twice, that we're supposed to bring forward line item transfers at the budget hearing.
No, at the deliberative, the first.
They called it the budget hearing.
I thought it was they were budget or deliberative?
Budget hearing.
First budget hearing. I thought.
And I don't think we do that.
I was wondering whether it was the budget hearing or the.
No, they did, because they did say deliberative session for other things, but they said at the first budget hearing, those line item transfers are supposed to come forward so that the taxpayers know that they occurred during the year. So that's something that we're going to have to start doing going forward.
Well, the first budget hearing, it's the first, we have one public hearing. We don't have a first and a second. I'd like clarification on that.
Yeah, we got to figure that out.
Make sure that they're talking about a budget hearing and not the deliberative session.
Yeah.
That's my only, I wasn't quite sure on what they meant by that, because you don't have the first budget hearing, public hearing, and then a scheduled second budget hearing. And so that, I'd like that clarification.
What I thought I heard is, in the spirit of just being transparent with people, at some point, the word was, or the description was first budget hearing, you have to just explain all those line item transfers we did. Do we need to do that? Sure. Now we just need to figure out what is constituted as first budget hearing.
And the other thing might be that they might not have explained it fully, and by the first budget hearing, they might have not been talking about an advisory budget committee, but a more controlling budget committee. What's the word that they use for it?
The public hearing.
No. There are two kinds of budget committees in the state.
Oh, no.
Some that run some that are in charge of the budgets, and some advisory. So they might have been referencing a meeting for
difference.
Yeah.
I think what they said before they started this, they said that what they were about to explain applied not to an advisory budget committee process, but to the statutory budget committee process that we have here in the town. So I think they basically said, the advisory stuff is interesting, doesn't apply here. It's more of a formal budget committee process.
So we do need clarification on that, just to see if we need to.
We just need to get the data, so when that first hearing is, everything else is
and what
just
they're
gotta
talking
explain
about
it.
and to what degree we have to, because the sheets that we get, what we first look at, there may be 40 sheets. They're saying she's taking it off of here, and so I think we need to get some direction on exactly what they're talking about. Any other comments? I've got somebody.
Yeah, the popcorn was delicious.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm going to open up to public comments now and questions. Yep.
Hey,
Bobby
Bobby.
Bedman, just a quick question, a couple quick questions. One, I think we do open it up to the public at the deliberative because John McDonald goes through the PowerPoint that Casey makes. Does that not address those items?
So that addresses the ups and downs of each line item within the budget
But not transfers.
from the 20, or from the previous year's approved budget to the proposed.
Sure.
It does not address any form of line item transfers.
So I think what we show and what John recites is what we're about to do.
And we,
These line item transfers that are being discussed is what we had to do. So it's a tensing. You know, in the past, given that we have a default budget, we have to explain what we did. And what happens with the upcoming budget is what we're going to do. Right? So they're different.
the PowerPoint that we see is here's 2023, here are the increases and decreases from that 23 budget, which will be the 2024 operating budget. This is the budget that has happened because the 2024 budget is not passed, which is called the default, and we do not go through it, the default budget, line by line,
Okay.
and we haven't, and it sounds like we may have to do more of that.
Okay. My question was, and just because I'm not looking at your paperwork, what happened with the SRO then, moving forward with the default budget? I'm sure you already know the answer on that.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
The
what you said.
SRO, we approved a position for the SRO for 1 year.
Yep.
And then, so this would be the default budget going to this. The school had it in their budget and they passed it, but then we have that position that we share. So what is happening with that officer?
Good question.
That was a Warren article.
Yeah.
And what it said is that after that year, that would go into the operating budget. So it was by Warren article in the 2023 budget, would be my
But
read.
did the police department pull it out of their budget?
It is not removed from the budget, and I think that's probably because it was a stand-alone warrant article that was approved
Same as the contracts.
for the full year. I think part of the reason why the school had it in there was there was a crossover of the years, if I understood them correctly.
They're in a different cycle, aren't they?
So that position will stay then with our police department?
That's correct.
That's not something
Yes.
that is going to
Yes.
be affected by this? Okay.
Yeah.
Because it was a standalone warrant article.
Yeah.
Just curious.
Good question.
Glad this wasn't.
Do I, come on up. Sure, take your time.
Go.
We need him on camera.
The TV wouldn't get them, yeah.
There he is.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
My name is Bob Tuffer, and I'm on the Budget Committee. I'm here with my chairman, John McDonald, and we thank you for the invitation this evening. I would like to speak to several things. When I heard that first public hearing, I felt, or I interpreted that to mean our public hearing. That's the way I understood it. And we never really discussed the full budget at our public hearing, so I think that's something we have to look at. Another thing I would like to talk about regarding the salary increases being carried forward and the health insurance or insurance is being carried forward. The salaries were not, I have a 219 amendment to the NHMA manual on budgeting. And it refers to a case in Hillsborough Superior Court. The case was Kirk versus Thomas Clow. And the ruling was the amount of money in a contract must be previously approved by the voters through an annual meeting budget process, which we heard tonight. But this means that employee raises should not be included unless they are required by a legally binding and previously ratified contract obligating the municipality to fill particular positions. And then it goes on, which we heard in this presentation tonight. However, that case and the discussion of that case does not talk about other benefits that go to the employees. It does not talk about insurances. And as we know, insurances are actually a different part of our budget now. They have their own. Our health insurance is it's all in one budget line, total. So I think that's something that could be looked at. It's very possible that this could be interpreted to mean salaries only cannot be increased. And at least I would hope so. So, and the third thing, or the last thing I would like to talk about is the new line. It was addressed in the presentation, and it basically says that no new budget lines can be added to the previous year's operating budget. And then it goes into the example which we are experiencing, which would be our revaluation. For example, if the previous year's operating budget had no appropriation for DRA's account number 4152, revaluation of property, that line cannot be added into the default budget because it does not fall within the definition of a default budget under RSA 40:13 IXB. So that's why you pulled, I'm assuming you pulled out the revaluation. Probably just as well because the real estate might be calming down and it might be better to be done next year anyway. So that concludes our remarks, and we hope to see you soon at our first meeting. And it's nice that Brian and Linda will be coming back. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Any other comments?
I would just add that as a reminder, this presentation put on by the Municipal Association was in December of 2022. So there could be some statutory changes which have taken place since that time. And, I'll do the research and get the answer to these questions. I don't know if I'll have them tomorrow night or not, but I'll see what I can find out.
Any other questions from the board? Can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All right. All those in favor? Aye. All righty. See you tomorrow night.
Good night.